Julian Vane didn't just want to move on, he wanted to win the divorce. Standing in his glass-walled sanctuary 40 floors above Park Avenue, he adjusted his silk tie and prepared to strike. He had just received a grainy screenshot of a hand-drawn wedding invitation. His ex-wife, Elena, was marrying some nobody named Leo at a crumbling roadside chapel. Julian let out a jagged laugh, his thumb hovering over the post button. Within seconds, he had shared the image with his 3 million followers, captioned with a lethal dose of faux pity. "So happy to see Eleanor finding a cozy life. If the budget gets tight for the brunch, let me know. My treat. Everyone deserves a second chance at a small life." It was a public execution of her dignity, a cruel broadcast intended to cement her as the loser in their story. But as the likes poured in, Julian had no idea he had just insulted a woman who was currently boarding a Gulfstream G700, bound for an empire he couldn't even afford to dream of. The air in Julian Vane's corner office smelled of expensive leather, ozone from the high-end air purifiers, and the faint metallic tang of ambition. Julian checked his wrist. The vintage gold Patek Philippe 1518 glinted under the recessed LED lights. To Julian, time wasn't a sequence of moments. It was a currency. And since the divorce from Elena 18 months ago, he felt he was finally spending it wisely. He turned back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, the yellow cabs of Manhattan looked like blood cells pumping through an artery he owned. He had built vain acquisitions on the bones of smaller companies, stripping them for parts with the surgical precision of a hawk. He lived in a world of more floor space, more leverage, more likes. His new fiancée, Genevieve, was the physical manifestation of that more. She was a former Miss New York with a degree in marketing and a face that had been curated by the city's finest dermatologists until she looked like an untouchable marble statue. His phone chirped on the polished mahogany desk. It was a WhatsApp message from Marcus, an old college friend who still hovered on the periphery of Elena's social circle. "Check this out, Jules. Looks like the ex-wife is finally settling for her speed." Julian opened the attachment. It was a photo of a wedding invitation that looked like it had been printed on recycled grocery bags. The calligraphy was shaky, the ink a faded sepia. "Join us for the union of Elena Vance and Leo Sterling. St. Jude's Chapel, followed by a brunch reception." "St. Jude's," Julian whispered, a smirk carving into his face. He knew the place. It was a weathered stone box on the edge of the Bronx, squashed between a 24-hour laundromat and a tire shop. It was where people went when they had $60 and a desperate need for a legal signature. The image of it, Eleanor, once the woman who sat at his side at the Met Gala, standing in a dingy vestibule with a Leo who likely wore a clip-on tie, sent a rush of dopamine through his system. During their marriage, Julian had always complained that Elena was an anchor. Her passion for pottery, her volunteer work at the local shelters, her refusal to wear the jewelry he bought her because it felt heavy. It had all felt so small to him. He had told her during their final icy dinner at Le Bernardin that she lacked the Vane spark. He had given her their suburban house and a year's worth of alimony, thinking it was a golden parachute into a life of irrelevance. He picked up his phone, his fingers dancing across the screen. He didn't just send it to the group chat. He went to Instagram. He went to Twitter. He wanted the world to see the contrast. "True love is about sacrifice," he typed, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "Wishing my ex, Elena, the best at her budget brunch. It's a far cry from the Tuscany estate Genevieve and I are booking, but I suppose some people are just meant for the simple things. Hashtag St. Jude's, hashtag budget wedding, hashtag cozy." He hit send. The satisfaction was instantaneous. The comments began to flood in. Derisive emojis from his business rivals, sycophantic laughs from his inner circle. He felt like a king who had just watched a rebellious peasant fall into the mud. The door to his office swung open and Genevieve swept in, the scent of Chanel No. 5 trailing her like a cloud of luxury. She was draped in a cream-colored Max Mara coat, her engagement ring, a 7-carat emerald cut, flashing like a lighthouse beacon. "Darling, the florist from Paris is on line 2, she said, her voice a practiced lilt. "He says the white peonies we want aren't in season, but he can fly them in from a private greenhouse in the Netherlands for an extra 20,000. "Do it," Julian said, not even looking up from his phone. "I want the wedding to be so bright it can be seen from space." "What are you looking at?" she asked, leaning over his shoulder. "Just a bit of comedy," Julian said, showing her the invitation. "Elena's big day, a brunch at St. Jude's. Can you imagine the smell of the grease from the laundromat next door while they say their vows?" Genevieve giggled, a sound like glass breaking. "It's almost poetic, isn't it? She's finally found her level. I almost feel sorry for her. Do you think her Leo is a librarian or a tax accountant?" "Probably both," Julian laughed. He stood up, crossing to the bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself a glass of 25-year-old Macallan. As the amber liquid swirled around the ice, a small, nagging memory flickered in his mind. The way Elena had looked the day she moved out. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She had simply handed him her house keys and a small handmade clay sparrow she had sculpted during their first year of marriage. "I hope you find the spark you're looking for, Julian," she had said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Because I finally found my peace." At the time, he had laughed. Peace was just a word losers used for failure. He looked at the clay sparrow, which now sat on his bookshelf, used as a paperweight for his acquisition files. It looked out of place in this room of chrome and glass. It looked real. He pushed the thought away, drowning it in a swallow of scotch. He was the winner. He had the watch, the office, the fiancé, and the public's adoration. Eleanor had a cardboard invitation and a brunch. But as he stared at the screen, watching the likes on his cruel post tick upward, he didn't see the private message Elena was receiving at that very moment. He didn't see the image of the Caribbean Sea, turquoise and infinite, outside the window of a luxury villa on an island that didn't appear on most maps. He didn't see the man standing behind her, a man whose name, Sterling, was whispered with reverence in the halls of Silicon Valley and the chambers of the Swiss banks. Julian Vane was a man who believed he saw everything, but he was about to learn that the most dangerous people in the world are the ones who don't feel the need to show you anything at all. The silence of Julian's office was broken by the rhythmic thump-thump of his own pulse. He was riding the high of social media validation, watching the retweets climb into the thousands. He felt like a conductor leading an orchestra of scorn. But beneath the chrome and the scotch, there was a restless itch, a need to see Elena's reaction, to witness the moment she realized she was a footnote in the grand biography of Julian Vane. While Julian was busy curating his digital war, Elena was experiencing a different kind of silence. She was seated in the plush cream leather interior of a Gulfstream G700. There were no cameras here, no live tweeting of the flight. The only sound was the low, comforting hum of the engines and the soft clink of a crystal glass being set down on a burled walnut table. Across from her sat Leo Sterling. If Julian was a lightning strike, loud, bright, and destructive, Leo was the deep ocean. He wore a simple navy t-shirt and linen trousers, his eyes fixed on a tablet displaying lines of code that looked like a foreign language. He was the man who had sold a revolutionary AI encryption protocol for 9 figures before he turned 30, yet he drove a 10-year-old Land Rover and preferred the smell of salt air to the scent of expensive cologne. "You're quiet," Leo said, his voice a low, warm vibration. He didn't look up from his screen, but his hand reached across the table, finding hers. His touch was grounding, a stark contrast to the way Julian used to grab her arm like a prize trophy. "I was just thinking about the invitation," Elena admitted, her gaze drifting to the window where the clouds looked like tufts of whipped cream. My sister Sophia called me. She said Julian posted it. He's making a spectacle of it. Leo finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with the defensive anger Julian would have shown. They were filled with a weary, almost paternal pity. He thinks he's looking at a map, Elena, but he's actually looking at a mirror. He only sees what he's afraid of becoming. Insignificant. The misdirection was a good idea, Elena said, a small smile tugging at her lips. The St. Jude's invitation had been Leo's suggestion, a piece of artful subterfuge designed to keep the paparazzi and the vain types away from their sanctuary. The real St. Jude's was a deconsecrated 17th-century chapel Leo had shipped, stone by stone, from the coast of Spain and reassembled on his private island, Sarafina. "Let him have his theatre," Leo said, squeezing her hand. "We're building a home." Back in Manhattan, the theatre was reaching a fever pitch. Julian was sitting in a windowless boardroom with a team of 3 wedding planners, 2 floral designers, and a publicist. He paid $5,000 a month just to keep his name in the social columns. "The Tuscany estate is secured," the head planner, a woman named Claire, who wore her hair in a bun so tight it seemed to pull her eyebrows upward, announced. "But the local municipality is giving us trouble about the fireworks. They say it disturbs the vineyards." Julian slammed his hand on the table, the noise echoing like a gunshot. "I don't care about the grapes, Claire. I want a pyrotechnic display that rivals the 4th of July. I want the people in Florence to think the sun is rising in the wrong direction. Pay the fine, double the bribe, just make it happen." Genevieve sat beside him, obsessively scrolling through a digital lookbook of Dior gowns. "Julian, the lace on the 3rd option is too traditional. I want something that looks like it was woven from moonlight and ego. Something that says Empress, not Bride." Julian barely heard her. His eyes were glued to his phone. He had found Sophia's original post, the one he had screenshotted, and he couldn't resist twisting the knife one more time. He decided to leave a public comment under his real, verified account. "So happy for you, Elena. The chapel looks cozy. If the budget gets tight for the brunch, let me know. I'd hate for your guests to go hungry. My treat, truly." He watched as the comment instantly gained hundreds of likes. He felt a surge of superiority so intense it was almost sexual. He was the gracious ex, the benevolent king throwing a bone to the peasant. "Julian, focus!" Genevieve snapped. "The seating chart. We have to decide if we're putting the Duchess of Alva next to the CEO of Tech Global. They're in the middle of a lawsuit." "Put them together," Julian said, a cruel light in his eyes. "Conflict makes for better photos. It keeps people talking." That was Julian's philosophy. Everything was a performance. His marriage to Elena had been a strategic partnership that failed because she refused to play the role of the silent, supporting actress. He remembered the night he had forbidden her from going to her pottery studio because he needed her to wear a specific gown to a gallery opening. "It's just mud, Elena," he had sneered. "This is a $5 million acquisition. Priorities." She had looked at him then with a look he hadn't understood at the time. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a person watching a building collapse from a safe distance. As the Gulf Stream descended toward the private airstrip on Sarafina, the world of Manhattan felt like a fever dream Elena had finally woken up from. The plane touched down with a silk-smooth grace. When the stairs lowered, the air hit her, warm, thick with the scent of jasmine, wild hibiscus, and the electric tang of the sea. There were no flashing bulbs here, no reporters, just a small electric moke waiting to whisk them away. They drove through a tunnel of emerald-green palms, the sunlight flickering through the fronds like gold leaf. When they reached the villa, it wasn't a sprawling, gold-plated monstrosity like Julian's penthouse. It was an architectural whisper, glass, driftwood, and local stone that seemed to grow out of the cliffside. "Welcome home," Leo said, leading her onto the terrace. Below them, the Caribbean stretched out, a sheet of hammered turquoise. In the distance, the 17th-century chapel stood on a jagged promontory, its ancient stones glowing in the late afternoon sun. It was majestic, silent, and utterly private. Elena walked to the edge of the infinity pool, her fingers trailing in the water. She thought of Julian's comment on Sophia's post. She had seen it just before they landed. It should have hurt, but instead, it felt like looking at a child throwing a tantrum in a sandbox. "Sophia is furious," Elena said, turning back to Leo. "She wants to post a photo of the island. She wants to crush him." Leo walked over and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "And what do you want, Eleanor?" She looked out at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a line so perfect it looked painted. She thought of the clay sparrow sitting on Julian's shelf, the only piece of her heart he had left. "I want him to keep believing he's right," she whispered. "I want him to be so blinded by his own light that he never sees us coming. The most beautiful things in the world don't need to be shouted, Leo. They just are." Leo kissed the top of her head. "Then let him shout into the void. We have a wedding to prepare for." But as Elena smiled, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't malice, but it was a quiet, steely resolve. Julian had spent years trying to make her feel small. He had turned her budget life into a punchline for the world to laugh at. He thought he was the architect of her humiliation. He had no idea that he was actually the architect of his own ruin, by mocking the saint. Jude's invitation, Julian had created a digital trail of his own cruelty, a trail that Leo's PR team was quietly archiving. The trap was set. Julian Vane, the man who worshipped the image, was about to be destroyed by the very lens he loved so much. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass, but tonight Julian Vane felt like the air inside was thinning. It was the night of his pre-union gala, a lavish, self-indulgent precursor to the Tuscany wedding, designed specifically to dominate the news cycle. He had spent $300,000 on white orchids alone, their scent so cloying it felt like a physical weight in the room. Julian stood by the bar, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo. His Patek Philippe felt heavy on his wrist, a golden shackle to a world he felt he was slipping away from, despite his best efforts to hold on. The metrics on his social media post about Elena's budget wedding had plateaued, and the dopamine hit was wearing off. He needed a new fix. He needed the world to see the contrast again. "Julian, stop looking at your phone," Genevieve hissed, gliding toward him in a dress made of silver sequins that caught the light like scales. She looked beautiful, but her eyes were hard, scanning the room for celebrities and high-net-worth individuals like a radar. "The CEO of Vanguard is here. He's looking at you. Smile. Look like the man who is winning." "I am winning, Jen," Julian snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. He took a deep gulp of gin and tonic, the lime rind bitter on his tongue. Earlier that day, Julian had committed his first major tactical error. During a high-stakes negotiation for the hostile takeover of Osprey Capital, he had been distracted. Instead of focusing on the EBITDA projections, he had been under the table, scrolling through a gossip blog that had picked up his jab at Elena. The blog had titled the piece, "Vane's Venom. High Society, Shark Mocks, Ex-Wife's Crumbling Chapel Nuptials." He had loved the headline. He had loved it so much that when the Osprey CEO asked for a final concession on employee pensions, Julian hadn't even listened. He'd simply waved his hand and said, "Whatever it takes to close, I have a wedding to plan." His COO, Marcus, had pulled him aside after the meeting, his face pale. "Julian, you just gave away the profit margin." "Why?" "Because," Julian had said, his eyes wild with a strange, frantic energy, "it doesn't matter. Once the world sees the Tuscany photos, our brand value will triple. We are selling a dream, Marcus. Elena is selling a nightmare in a laundromat. Contrast is our best asset." Now, at the gala, that same hubris was driving him toward a cliff. He saw a group of socialites whispering near the orchid wall, their eyes darting to him. He assumed they were admiring his tuxedo. In reality, they were discussing the rumors that Julian Vane was becoming obsessed with a woman he claimed to have forgotten. Julian walked to the center of the room and tapped a crystal glass with a silver spoon. The chime was sharp, cutting through the jazz music. "Friends, colleagues, and those I haven't sued yet," he began, a practiced smirk on his face. The room erupted in sycophantic laughter. "We're here to celebrate the future, my future with the stunning Genevieve, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the past. I think we all saw the invitation circulating online today." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Marcus caught Julian's eye, shaking his head slightly. "Don't do it, Julian." But Julian couldn't stop. The need to crush Elena was a fever. It's a reminder that some people are content with the ground, while others were born for the stars. To Elena, "I hope the brunch is edible. To us, may our champagne never be domestic, and our chapels never be located next to a tire shop." He raised his glass. The room followed suit, but the cheer was hollow. The air felt brittle. An hour later, Julian was tucked into a leather booth in the corner of the lounge with a potential investor, a man named Sterling. Not the Sterling, but a distant cousin who managed a boutique fund. "So, Julian," the man said, swirling his drink, "you seem very focused on this ex-wife of yours. Elena, right?" "It's just a joke." Julian dismissed him, his heart beginning to thud. "A bit of sport. She was an anchor. I'm just enjoying the fact that I'm finally unmoored." "Interesting," the man replied, his voice neutral, "because I heard a rumor in the valley about a guy named Leo, a developer, very quiet, very, very wealthy. Word is he's getting married this weekend on a private island. Some people are saying it's the wedding of the decade." Julian's grip on his glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Leo? There are 1,000 Leos in tech. She's marrying a nobody. I saw the chapel, for God's sake. It's a ruin." "Maybe," the man said, standing up. "But in my experience, the loudest man in the room is rarely the most powerful. Good luck with the Tuscany thing, Julian. I'll let you know about the investment." Julian watched him walk away. A cold drip of sweat ran down his spine. He pulled out his phone and searched for Leo Sterling. Thousands of results appeared. He searched Leo Sterling AI. A single grainy photo of a man in a black hoodie appeared from a tech conference 3 years ago. The caption, "The Ghost of Silicon Valley." Julian stared at the screen. The man in the photo had a quiet, unshakable gaze. He looked like the kind of man who didn't need to tap a glass to get a room's attention. He looked like the kind of man who could buy Julian's entire building just to tear it down for the view. "No," Julian whispered to the empty booth. "She doesn't know people like that. She likes mud and pottery." He looked over at the bookshelf across the room, where the small clay sparrow Eleanor had made sat. In the harsh, artificial light of the gala, the sparrow looked out of place, humble, earthy, and strangely dignified. In a fit of sudden, inexplicable rage, Julian stood up and walked to the shelf. He grabbed the sparrow. It felt warm, as if it still held the heat of the kiln, or perhaps the heat of Elena's hands. He wanted to crush it. He wanted to turn it back into the mud she loved so much. But he didn't. Instead, he shoved it into the pocket of his tuxedo. A hidden weight. A reminder of a woman who had handed him her peace while he had only ever given her his noise. He looked at the room, the sequins, the orchids, the champagne, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, it all looked like cardboard. It looked like a set that could be knocked over by a single strong breeze. He checked his phone again. One new notification. A public post from a world-renowned chef, a man Julian had tried and failed to book for his own wedding. "Off to a private island for the most beautiful union I've ever had the honor to cater. No cameras, no press, just pure soul. #The real St. Jude's." The glass in Julian's hand finally shattered. He didn't even feel the shards cutting into his palm. He only felt the cold realization that he might have made the biggest mistake of his life. He hadn't just mocked a budget wedding, he had mocked a titan. The morning light in Julian's penthouse was unforgiving. It hit the shards of crystal still embedded in the rug and the dried blood on his bandaged palm with a surgical coldness. Julian sat at his breakfast table, a cup of black coffee steaming untouched before him. In his pocket, the clay sparrow Elena had made felt like a hot coal. He had spent the early hours of the morning in a digital rabbit hole, his eyes bloodshot. The hashtag the real St. Jude's was trending, but it was a ghost of a trend. No photos of the bride, no location tags, just cryptic posts from the world's elite. A famous cellist mentioned tuning her strings to the sound of the Caribbean wind. A billionaire philanthropist posted a photo of a vintage 1950s seaplane with the caption, "Heading to a sanctuary where wealth is silent." Julian's phone buzzed. It was a news alert from the Wall Street Journal. Sterling AI founder Leo Sterling, rumored to be marrying this weekend. The coffee in Julian's stomach turned to lead. He pulled up the article. There was no mention of Elena, but the description of the groom matched the Leo from the invitation. Leo Sterling, the man who had just closed a deal with the Department of Defense that dwarfed Julian's entire net worth. "It's a mistake," Julian hissed to the empty room. "She's a potter, she's a volunteer, she doesn't know billionaires." But the seed of doubt had grown into a forest. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to prove that the St. Jude's in the Bronx was the real one, that Elena was currently standing in a drafty hall eating lukewarm eggs. He grabbed his car keys and descended to the garage. He didn't take the chauffeured Maybach, he took his silver Ferrari, a car built for speed and aggression. He tore through the city, heading north, leaving the polished streets of Manhattan for the grey industrial sprawl of the Bronx. When he arrived at the address on the invitation, his heart leapt with a sick sense of triumph. St. Jude's Chapel was exactly what he had pictured. It was a squat, crumbling building of soot-stained stone. A for-lease sign hung crookedly from a rusted fence. To the left was a laundromat with a flickering neon sign. To the right, a tire shop where a man was loudly revving an engine. There were no private jets. There were no world-class chefs. There was only a stray cat sitting on a pile of discarded newspapers. "I knew it," Julian laughed, the sound echoing off the Ferrari's windshield. "I knew she was lying. It was all a bluff." He got out of the car, his designer loafers crunching on broken glass. He pulled out his phone, ready to take a video to end the rumors once and for all. He wanted to show his followers the billionaire wedding in its true, pathetic glory. He walked up to the chapel doors, which were chained shut. He peered through a cracked window. The interior was empty, filled with dust motes dancing in the dim light. There were no pews, no altar, just a few discarded crates and an old broom. Then his eyes caught something. Tucked into the corner of the doorframe was a small, laminated card. He pulled it out. It wasn't an invitation. It was a business card for a company called Seaside Suppers. On the back, written in the same sweet, amateur-ish calligraphy from the invitation, were two words. Wrong one. Julian's breath hitched. He turned the card over. Below the catering logo was a QR code. With trembling hands he scanned it. His phone screen flickered, then opened a private, password-protected gallery. The password was already filled in, a cookie stored from the link Marcus had sent him. The first image loaded. It was a panoramic shot of an island that looked like a jagged emerald dropped into a sea of liquid sapphire. In the center of the island, perched on a cliff, was a chapel. It was made of the same ancient stone as the Bronx building, but it had been meticulously restored, its stained glass windows glowing like jewels under the tropical sun. The next photo showed a long, white linen table set on a terrace overlooking the ocean. The centerpieces weren't orchids. They were simple, elegant arrangements of local driftwood and sea glass, interspersed with hand-thrown ceramic bowls, Elena's work. The final photo made Julian's knees give out. It was Elena. She was standing on the deck of a yacht, the wind catching a dress of white silk that seemed to flow like water. She wasn't wearing the heavy diamonds Julian had once forced upon her. She was wearing a simple sapphire pendant. Beside her, his arm draped protectively around her waist, was Leo Sterling. He was looking at her with an expression of such raw, unadulterated adoration that Julian felt like an intruder. Underneath the photo was a caption, "The real St. Jude's. Thank you for the misdirection, Julian. We wanted to make sure only the people who mattered were watching." The realization hit Julian like a physical blow. The Bronx invitation hadn't been a sign of Elena's poverty, it had been a test of Julian's character, a trap designed to lure out his vanity and broadcast it to the world, and he had walked right into it. He had mocked a woman who was currently presiding over a kingdom he couldn't even buy his way into. His phone began to vibrate incessantly, notifications from his board of directors, emails from his investors. "Julian, why is the Osprey CEO pulling out of the deal?" "Julian, have you seen the wrong one trend on Twitter? Your brand is being slaughtered." "Julian, Genevieve is on line 1. She's hysterical." He looked around at the Bronx street, the tire shop, the laundromat, the grey sky. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. In a daze, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the clay sparrow. In this light, against the backdrop of the crumbling chapel, the sparrow didn't look humble. It looked indestructible. It was a piece of the earth, fired in a kiln built to last. Julian, on the other hand, was built of glass and ego. He looked at the QR code again. A new video had been uploaded to the gallery. It was a short clip of the wedding ceremony. Elena and Leo were standing at the altar of the island chapel. "I, Leo, take you, Elena, not as a prize to be won, but as a soul to be honored." Julian closed his eyes, but he couldn't shut out the sound of Elena's voice, clear and steady, drifting through his speakers. "I, Elena, take you, because you saw the beauty in the mud." A single tear, hot and stinging, tracked down Julian's cheek. He realized then that he hadn't just lost the divorce war. He had lost the only thing that had ever been real in his life. He had traded a woman of substance for a life of shadows, and now the shadows were swallowing him whole. Behind him, the man from the tire shop revved the engine again, a harsh, grating sound that filled the air. Julian Vane, the king of Park Avenue, stood in the dirt of the Bronx and realized he was utterly, completely alone. The drive back from the Bronx to Manhattan was the longest 60 minutes of Julian Vane's life. The Ferrari's engine, usually a symphony of power, now sounded like a frantic, trapped animal. He kept his hand in his pocket, his fingers white-knuckled around the clay sparrow. The rough texture of the fired earth was the only thing that felt solid as the digital world around him began to liquefy. By the time he reached the George Washington Bridge, the Vane's venom story had mutated. It wasn't just a gossip tidbit anymore. It was a viral phenomenon. A popular YouTube drama channel had already uploaded a video titled "The Billionaire, the Potter and the Fool: How Julian Vane Mocked His Way into Social Suicide." Julian's phone was a hornet's nest. He pulled over into a breakdown lane, the hazard lights blinking like a panicked heartbeat. He opened Instagram. His most recent post, the one mocking the paper plates, had been flooded with over 50,000 comments. They weren't from his usual sycophants. "This aged like milk," one comment with 10,000 likes read. "Imagine calling a sterling wedding budget. Julian, you're the only one here who looks cheap." The audacity to offer to pay for the brunch when the groom literally owns the satellite you're using to post this. LMAO. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He switched to the news. A headline on Bloomberg sent a fresh jolt of ice through his veins. Osprey Capital withdraws from Vane acquisition, citing brand volatility and judgment concerns. "No!" Julian gasped, hitting the steering wheel. "No, no, no!" He sped toward his office, ignoring the speed cameras. He needed to control the narrative. He was the master of the spin. He would hire a crisis PR firm. He would issue an apology that sounded like a victory. He would fix this. But when he stepped into the lobby of Vane Acquisitions, the atmosphere had shifted. The security guards, men who usually snapped to attention at the sight of him, lingered a second too long before nodding. The receptionist didn't look up. She was staring at her monitor, where a live stream of a seaplane landing on a Caribbean turquoise bay was playing. Julian marched into his office. Marcus was there, standing by the window, his suit jacket off, his tie loosened. He looked 10 years older. "Tell me it's not as bad as it looks," Julian demanded, throwing his keys onto the desk. Marcus turned around, his eyes vacant. "It's worse, Julian. I just got off the phone with the board. They're calling an emergency session. Peterson from Osprey didn't just walk away. He sent a memo to every major player in the city. He said he doesn't do business with men who prioritize petty domestic theater over fiduciary duty." "It was a joke," Julian roared, his voice cracking. "A social media bit. Since when did this city lose its sense of humor?" "It's not about the humor, Julian," Marcus said, his voice a low, steady thrum of disappointment. "It's about the fact that you were outplayed by a woman you told everyone was a mediocre anchor. You made yourself look small, and in this town, small is contagious." The door to the office burst open. Genevieve stood there, her face a mask of cold, calculated fury. She wasn't wearing her Max Mara coat. She was wearing a sharp black Chanel suit, and she was holding her phone like a weapon. "My mother just called me from Palm Beach," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "She asked me if I was really marrying a man who is the laughingstock of the internet. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my sponsorships? I just lost the Tiffany campaign, Julian. They said my association with your public image is currently non-compliant with their values." Julian looked at her, the woman he had chosen because she was a perfect upgrade. In the harsh afternoon light, her beauty felt brittle, like a porcelain doll that had been left out in the rain. "Jen, darling, we'll fix it," Julian said, reaching for her. "We'll move the wedding up, we'll make it bigger, There is no we, Julian," she snapped, stepping back. "I spent the last 2 hours reading about Leo Sterling. Do you know he's donating $50 million to marine conservation today? In Elena's name? The world sees her as a saint and you as a schoolyard bully. I am a brand, Julian. And right now your brand is toxic." She reached for the clasp of her 7-carat engagement ring. Julian watched, paralyzed, as she slid the massive diamond off her finger. It made a sharp clinking sound as she dropped it onto the mahogany desk. "Keep the rock," she said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Use it to pay for your crisis firm, or better yet, use it to buy yourself some class. Goodbye, Julian." She turned and swept out of the office. The click of her heels on the marble floor sounded like the counting down of a clock. Julian sank into his leather chair. The silence in the office was suffocating. He looked at the ring on the desk, a gaudy, glittering symbol of everything he had tried to build. It looked meaningless. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the clay sparrow. He set it on the desk next to the 7-carat diamond. The contrast was staggering. The diamond was cold, sharp, and meant to be seen. The sparrow was warm, rounded, and meant to be held. An emotional fantasy flickered in his mind, a memory he had suppressed for years. He saw Eleanor in their old kitchen, her hands covered in grey slip, her face glowing with the heat of the kiln. She had been laughing at something he said. He hadn't been a titan then, he had just been Julian. And she had loved him. He realized then that he had spent the last decade trying to build a kingdom of glass, only to realize that glass breaks. Elena hadn't built a kingdom, she had grown a soul. He picked up the sparrow, his thumb tracing the wing. For a second, he imagined he could feel the ghost of her touch. Then his monitor flickered. A new post from a guest at the real wedding. It was a video of the reception. There was no booming music, no flashing lights. Just the sound of a cello and the laughter of a few friends. The camera panned to Elena. She was dancing with Leo. They weren't performing for the camera. They were looking at each other as if they were the only two people in a universe that had finally stopped making noise. Julian watched the video on a loop. He watched until the sun began to set, casting long bloody shadows across his corner office. He was a man who had everything, yet as he sat in the dark, clutching a piece of mud, he realized he had never been more bankrupt. The phone on his desk rang. It was the board of directors. Julian didn't answer. He just watched Elena dance, a ghost in his own glass palace. The walls of Julian Vane's world had not just cracked. They had dissolved into a fine grey ash. A week had passed since the St. Jude's trap, and the silence in his life was now more deafening than the loudest mockery. He had been retired from his own company, a polite term for a legal decapitation. His board of directors had leveraged a morality clause he himself had written to oust a previous rival, a poetic irony that tasted like copper in his mouth. He was no longer in the penthouse. The bank had frozen his primary accounts pending an audit of the Osprey deal's failure. He was staying at the St. Regis, but even the gold-leafed mouldings of the hotel suite felt like the bars of a cage. He sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, a glass of cheap room-service scotch in his hand, staring at a single invitation that had arrived not by mail, but via a courier who looked like an undercover agent. It was an invitation to the unveiling of the Sterling Vance Marine Wing at the American Museum of Natural History. There was no mockery on the card, no clever jabs, just a cold, elegant request for his presence. Elena wanted him to see, or perhaps, Julian thought with a flicker of his old toxic hope, she wanted to see him. Maybe this was the moment she would finally admit that all of this, the island, the billionaire, the philanthropy, was just a grand performance to win him back. She wants a reaction, Julian whispered to the dim room, his eyes bloodshot. She wants me to see what I lost, so I'll beg. He spent 3 hours dressing. He chose his most expensive charcoal suit, a Tom Ford masterpiece that felt like armor. He spent 30 minutes perfecting his silk tie, his hands shaking so violently he had to start over 4 times. He looked at himself in the mirror. The vain spark was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation that no amount of expensive tailoring could hide. In his pocket, he felt the weight of the clay sparrow. He had tried to throw it away a dozen times, but it always found its way back to his dresser. It was a tether to a reality he was no longer sure he understood. When he arrived at the museum, the spectacle was unlike anything Julian had ever orchestrated. There were no flashing paparazzi bulbs at the entrance. Leo Sterling had bought out the security of the entire block to ensure total privacy for his guests. The elite of the world were there. Heads of state, Nobel laureates, and tech titans who usually avoided the public eye. Julian walked through the grand rotunda, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like a ghost haunting his own funeral. He saw Marcus across the room, talking to a cabinet secretary. When Marcus saw Julian, he didn't sneer. He simply turned his back, a silent social execution. Then the room went quiet. Elena and Leo appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Julian's breath hitched. This was the show-up. But it wasn't the American soap opera moment he had rehearsed in his head. Elena wasn't dripping in revenge diamonds. She was wearing a dress of simple midnight blue velvet that matched the deep ocean she was trying to save. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face that looked peaceful. That was the word that gutted Julian. She looked like a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be looked down upon. Leo stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He wasn't the beige accountant or the mysterious titan. He was just a man who looked at his wife as if she were the source of all light in the room. Julian pushed through the crowd, his Tom Ford armor feeling heavier with every step. He didn't care about the stares or the whispers. He reached the foot of the stairs just as they descended. "Elena," he gasped, his voice cracking. The couple stopped. The space around them seemed to expand, a vacuum of high society tension. Leo's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture shifting into that of a quiet shield, but Elena placed a hand on his arm. She looked at Julian. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She looked at him with a profound, devastating neutrality. "Julian," she said. Her voice was steady, lacking the old tremor of deference he had spent years cultivating in her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I saw the wing," Julian blurted out, gesturing vaguely at the multi-million-dollar exhibit behind them. "The donations, the island, the everything. I get it, Elena. You won. You made your point." He waited for the soap opera reveal. He waited for her to tell him how much she hated him, how every cent of Leo's billions was a weapon used to destroy him. He wanted the drama because drama meant he still mattered. Elena stepped forward, away from Leo's protective shadow. She looked Julian directly in the eyes. "You think this is about you, Julian?" she asked softly. "Isn't it?" Julian's voice rose, a desperate, pathetic sound. "The misdirection, the fake chapel, the public humiliation. You lured me out. You wanted the world to see me as a fool." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "The misdirection wasn't to lure you in, Julian. It was to see if you had changed. I hoped, that for once you would just be happy for me. That you would see a simple invitation and think, 'I'm glad she found peace.' If you had done that, you wouldn't even be here. You would still have your company. You would still have your life." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a scalpel. "I didn't destroy your brand, Julian. You did. You took a woman's happiness and tried to turn it into a punchline for your ego. The wrong one wasn't the chapel. It was the man I thought you could be." Julian felt the world tilt. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the clay sparrow, holding it out like a white flag. "I kept this. I realized what it was, what you were." Elena looked at the sparrow. For a fleeting second, a shadow of pain crossed her face, a memory of the girl who used to believe mud could be art. Then she looked back at Julian, and the shadow vanished. "That's just a piece of clay, Julian," she said. "It hasn't been us for a long time. You can keep it, or you can break it. It doesn't change the fact that there is no more mud in my life, only the ocean." She turned back to Leo, who took her hand and kissed her knuckles. It wasn't a performance for Julian. It was a private moment that Julian was merely haunting. "Goodbye, Julian," Leo said, his voice a low, final rumble. "I hope you find a way to live in a world where you aren't the center of the universe. It's a very large place. You might enjoy it." They walked past him, their shared laughter swallowed by the crowd. Julian stood at the base of the stairs, clutching a clay bird in a room full of titans, and realized the most terrifying truth of all. She hadn't spent a single second of her billionaire life trying to get revenge on him. She had simply moved on to a world where he didn't exist. He wasn't the villain of her story. He was just a footnote she had finally stopped reading. The show-up was over, and Julian Vane had never felt more invisible. The exit from the American Museum of Natural History was not a walk. It was a slow-motion drowning. Julian Vane descended the stone steps into a Manhattan night that felt colder than any winter he had ever known. The city lights, once his concrete kingdom, now looked like a million indifferent eyes watching him fail. He didn't call a car. He couldn't. His corporate accounts had been officially shuttered an hour ago, and his personal credit cards had been flagged for unusual activity by a bank that sensed the blood in the water. He walked toward the St. Regis, his bespoke loafers, which had cost more than a teacher's monthly salary, clicking rhythmically on the pavement, a countdown to a zero-sum game. The resolution of Julian Vane's life was not a single explosion, but a series of quiet, devastating whimpers. When he reached the hotel, the concierge, a man who had previously greeted him by name and with a glass of chilled, sparkling water, informed him that his suite had been booked by another party. His luggage had already been packed and moved to the holding room. "There seems to be an issue with the guarantee on the room, Mr. Vane," the concierge said, his voice polite but stripped of the warmth that usually accompanied a 5-figure-a-night guest. "We've taken the liberty of securing a small storage unit for your effects until your situation is resolved." Julian didn't argue. The Tom Ford armor felt like it was made of lead. He stood in the lobby, surrounded by the ghosts of his own influence, and felt the weight of the clay sparrow in his pocket. It was the only thing he owned that didn't require a credit check. He spent the next 48 hours in a haze of legal proceedings and digital firestorms. His hard karma arrived in the form of a televised panel on a major financial news network. The segment was titled, "The Hubris of the Alpha, Why Vane Acquisitions Collapsed in a Week." A prominent PR analyst looked directly into the camera. "It wasn't just a bad deal," she said. "Julian Vane broke the cardinal rule of modern business. Don't be a villain in someone else's fairy tale. By mocking Elena Vance, now Mrs. Sterling, he aligned his brand with petty cruelty. In a world that values authenticity and impact, Julian Vane became the ultimate bad investment." The legal fees were a locust swarm. The Osprey CEO, Peterson, hadn't just walked away. He had filed a lawsuit for deceptive negotiation practices, claiming Julian's distraction during the meetings was a breach of duty. Julian had to sell the Ferrari, the Patek Philippe, and finally the penthouse itself. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a faceless high-rise in Queens. It wasn't cozy like the chapel he had mocked. It was sterile, smelling of industrial lemon cleaner and the stale coffee of his own regret. There were no floor-to-ceiling windows. There was just a single grimy pane that looked out onto a brick wall and a maze of fire escapes. Every morning, Julian would sit at a small formica-top table and open his laptop. It was a digital haunting. He would see Eleanor, in the headlines. She wasn't just the billionaire's wife. She was a titan in her own right. Her ceramics brand, Terama, had partnered with the MoMA. A profile in Vogue featured her on the cover, not in Tuscany, but in a remote village in Southeast Asia, her hands covered in mud as she demonstrated a sustainable water filtration system she had co-designed with Leo. The article praised her quiet resilience and her unshakable sense of self. It mentioned in a single biting footnote that her previous marriage had been an unfortunate era of artistic suppression. Julian was the footnote. He looked at his own social media. He was no longer a person, he was a meme. Every time a wealthy person did something arrogant, the comments would be flooded with, "Giving off major Vane energy," or "Don't pull a Julian." He had achieved the immortality he always wanted, but it was the immortality of a punchline. One rainy Tuesday, Julian found himself at a small, independent bookstore a few blocks from his new apartment. He was looking for a book on small business management, a last-ditch effort to restart his life as a consultant. Near the back of the store, he saw a display of ceramic bowls. They were organic in shape, glazed in a deep midnight blue that reminded him of the museum staircase. He picked one up. It felt heavy, grounded, and incredibly beautiful. He turned it over. On the bottom, etched into the clay, was the Terama logo and the initials EV. A woman standing next to him, a student by the look of her, smiled. "Beautiful, right? They say she makes the first 1,000 of every collection herself. She says it keeps her grounded." "It's just mud," Julian whispered, the words tasting like ash. "No," the girl corrected him, her eyes bright. "It's history. You can feel the intention in it. It's real." Julian set the bowl back down. He felt a pang of envy so fierce it made his stomach clench. It wasn't envy of the money or the billionaire husband. It was envy of the peace. Elena had a life that was real. Everything Julian had ever built had been a performance for an audience that had already left the theatre. He walked back to his apartment through the rain, his cheap umbrella rattling in the wind. When he got inside, he sat on his bed and pulled the clay sparrow from his pocket. He looked at the little bird. It was chipped now, a small piece of the wing missing from when he had dropped it in his frantic move. He remembered the night he had told Elena her hobbies didn't pay the bills. He remembered the way he had laughed at her simple tastes. He realized then that the show-up at the museum hadn't been the end. The resolution was this: the long, quiet years of living with the knowledge that he had been the architect of his own exclusion from a world of meaning. He had been so busy looking for the vain spark that he had missed the fire that had been right in front of him. He picked up a small, fine-tipped pen from his desk. On the bottom of the clay sparrow, next to the small E she had carved years ago, Julian wrote a single word in tiny, cramped letters: sorry. He didn't send it. There was no island address to mail it to, and he knew she wouldn't want it anyway. He just set the sparrow on his windowsill, facing the brick wall. For the first time in his life, Julian Vane wasn't looking for a like or a share. He was just sitting in the silence, listening to the rain, and for a fleeting, terrifying, and strangely hopeful moment, he felt human. The king was gone. Only the man remained, and the man had a very long way to go. A year and a half after the Vane name had vanished from the headlines, the city of New York felt different to the man who used to try and own it. Julian stood in a small, drafty community center in Astoria, the scent of damp wool and industrial heater humming in the background. It was a far cry from the ozone-scented air of Park Avenue, but for the first time in a decade, Julian felt he was breathing. He was wearing a simple grey sweatshirt, unbranded, slightly frayed at the cuffs. He was no longer the hawk of Manhattan. He was a man who spent his Tuesday nights at a communal pottery wheel, his hands stained with the very mud he had once called worthless. The clay was cold and stubborn against his palms. As the wheel spun, Julian closed his eyes, trying to find the center. In the world of acquisitions, centering meant leverage. Here, it meant balance. It meant listening to the material instead of forcing it to bend to his will. Every time he pushed too hard, the clay collapsed into a slumped, wet mess. "Patience, Julian," the instructor said, a woman named Martha who had no idea who he used to be. "You're trying to dominate it. You have to dance with it." Julian took a deep breath, his fingers light and steady. He thought of Elena. Not the billionaire's wife or the woman who won, but the girl who had sat across from him in their first apartment, her face smudged with grey slip, her eyes bright with a quiet, internal fire. He finally understood why she loved this. In the silence of the studio, there was no audience. There were no likes. There was only the truth of what you created with your own two hands. After class, Julian walked toward the subway. The evening air was crisp, smelling of salt from the nearby East River. He stopped at a small neighborhood park and sat on a weathered bench. He pulled the clay sparrow from his pocket. The sorry he had written on the bottom had faded slightly, the ink soaking into the porous ceramic. The bird was battered, its chipped wing a testament to the turbulent path it had traveled. Julian looked at it for a long time. It was a beautiful thing, born from a heart that had loved him before he became a monster. He didn't need to keep it anymore. The sparrow had done its job. It had carried him back to the ground. He walked over to a small hidden nook at the base of an old oak tree, where a community spirit garden had been started by local children. There were painted rocks, small plastic dinosaurs, and handfuls of acorns arranged in patterns. Julian knelt, the fabric of his trousers pressing into the dirt, and placed the sparrow in the center of the garden. It looked right there. It was home. He stood up and checked his phone. No news alerts, no market crashes, just a text from a local non-profit where he had started volunteering his time to help small businesses with their accounting. "Thanks for the help today, Julian. The neighborhood bodega is going to stay open because of those tax credits you found. See you next week." It was a small victory, a budget victory. But as Julian walked away, he felt a lightness in his chest that no private jet could ever provide. Across the ocean, on the island of Sarafina, the sun was setting in a riot of violet and gold. Elena Sterling sat on her terrace, a sketchbook open in her lap. Leo was a few feet away, reading a book on marine biology, his feet propped up on the stone railing. Elena looked at her phone. She had seen a grainy, accidental photo of Julian in a local Queen's newsletter a few weeks ago, helping a bakery owner move crates. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel pity. She simply felt a quiet, distant hope that he was finally finding his center. She closed her sketchbook and looked out at the sea. The waves hit the cliffs below the 17th century chapel with a steady, ancient rhythm. "Leo," she whispered. He looked up, his eyes warm and present. "Yeah? I think I'm going to start a new collection. Something simple, something that feels like a beginning." Leo smiled, the kind of smile that made the world feel small and safe. "I can't wait to see it." So, the story of Julian and Elena was over. The noise had faded. The mocking laughter had been swallowed by the wind. And in the silence that remained, there was only the sound of the tide, the scent of the jasmine, and the quiet, unshakable weight of peace. Thank you for joining us for this cinematic journey of pride, hidden wealth, and the ultimate redemption of the human spirit. Julian's downfall reminds us that while money can buy a kingdom, it cannot buy character. And Elena's triumph shows us that the most powerful revenge is a life lived with authentic joy. If you enjoyed this 8-part narrative and want to see more stories of poetic justice, hard-hitting karma, and emotional growth, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth. And don't forget to subscribe for weekly tales that explore the deep complexities of the human heart. Your support keeps these stories alive. Until next time, stay authentic.